So, you like Longlegs? Can I interest you in a slap-together slasher from the 1980s that may have had a little influence on it? What if I told you it was basically Texas Chainsaw Massacre but with an effete clown? No, I get it, you're a hard sell. You're obviously an audience of refined taste. Not like those rubes that were in here last week. What if I throw in the feature debut of TV's Peter Krause? Look, just watch the
Through the tulips, wish back.
Blood Harvest is a 1987 slasher movie from journeyman Bill Rebane, the man behind the classic The Giant Spider Invasion, and a post-Jesse Ventura Reform Party candidate for governor of Wisconsin. And yes, before you fumble over yourself into the comments, George Costanza style, to tell me that Ventura was governor of Minnesota, I'm aware of that. What I mean is that Ventura's election was a clarion call to every weirdo populist with an axe to grind to run as part of the Reform Party. And that's what ultimately killed the party as a viable third option. In fairness, though, I can barely find anything about Rebane's politics other than he ran. So maybe he would have solved the ills of the world if given half a chance. By the way, the field was so crowded that year that third-party candidates split the conservative vote enough for Democrat Jim Doyle to sneak out a win over incumbent Republican Scott McCallum. I bring all this up because Rebane and the 4 screenwriters who worked on this film based the story around a populist rallying cry. That being, the rent is too damn high. That's the problem for the tiny Wisconsin community of Winchester, where the bank is foreclosing on farm after farm. This makes our lead girl, Jill, played by Antonia Salchek, highly unpopular among the locals upon her return from college, because her father is in charge of executing the foreclosures.
The Robinson family isn't exactly popular around here right now.
I didn't do fucking shit!
When she arrives home, her parents are missing, the house has been vandalized, and her father is hanged in effigy. This is where we meet Marvelous Mervo, who is just hanging out in Jill's house.
I just come to welcome you home, Jill.
She seems more annoyed by him than frightened, though, and this is where you can see some parallels to Longlegs. Although Nicolas Cage clearly looked at Tiny Tim's performance and said, "Geez, you're a little over the top, don't you think?"
I brought you some flowers, Jill.
Mervo's brother Gary comes to the rescue, though, and tells Jill her parents are around somewhere, but they're not very popular. They really want to drive home that the town's mad at the parents. Someone throws a brick through Jill's window, and Mervo is still hanging around, so Jill puzzlingly decides to hoof it through the woods into town. That's where she's pursued by a camouflage stalker and shot in the head. Oh, but it turns out she just wandered into the middle of a paintball game, being held by the local Letterkenny Theater production group. This film, along with Bloodhook and the baffling Bloodbeat, establishes a Wisconsin core aesthetic that I've come to appreciate. Somehow everything looks like it's off-brand Canadian and that it was shot 10 years before it actually was. You know, except for the Lisa Frank shirt. The sheriff is, of course, no help. He just wants to play softball. But when they get back to Jill's house, everything has been repaired, so she looks like a big fibber. Merv is keeping someone tied up in a little freighty hole outside the farmhouse. Outside of the kitchen scene, he seemed a little detached from the movie. Like maybe they only had a day or two to shoot with Tiny Tim and just had him do some weird stuff to pad out the runtime. It turns out Jill is neither faking it nor is she losing her mind. Gary, her friendly neighbor and former boyfriend, cleaned up while she was in town. They climb into their spacious old treehouse and Gary reminisces about his parents' death. He says Merv is taking it especially hard. After some frolicking among the cattails, Jill tells Gary she met someone and got engaged. He's disappointed, but says he expected someone to snap up a great girl like Jill. I'm not sure why she would want anyone else. Gary was handy enough to repaint the house, clean it, and repair one of the windows in the span of a few hours. You don't walk away from that kind of Dan Connor energy easily. That night, someone is messing with the hot water while Jill tries to take a shower. This gives us the requisite nude scene because this is a slasher film after all. Merv skulks into the place and tries to molest her before she brushes him off.
Can I make myself happy too?
I mean, you can, but you'll go blind. That night, Jill's reading time is interrupted by someone sitting on her squeaky childhood swing. She calls the sheriff, but of course he's still salty about the false alarm from earlier. He promises to come out, but he's taking his sweet-ass time. Jill's fiancé Scott calls, and you can really see why she hit it off with him. their banter is top-notch.
The sound of your voice is so good.
The sheriff arrives moments later with nothing in the film language to indicate the passage of time. She just hangs up with the sheriff, gets a call from Scott, and then the sheriff is there. We're moving along at quite a clip here. With Merv safely off the property, Jill can get a good night's sleep. Except some weirdo ethers her and takes nudie photos of her when she's passed out. It is at this point where I think it's reasonable to ask, is any of this going anywhere? We're half an hour in, and after some intriguing setup about Jill's family being public enemy number one, it's just been a series of set pieces featuring Jill being way too patient with Merv. Scott shows up the next morning, being played by baby Peter Krause in his Clayton Roner starter kit. He demonstrates the exact kind of line delivery that would lead to an Aaron Sorkin gig.
Let's start with a little smooching.
Don't talk to him like he's other people. Jill ups the kink factor by involving some chase play, but it's a small house, so they really just go downstairs. According to IMDb, Peter Krause refused to take his pants off during the love scene, so I guess he and Tobias Funke are part of the same Never Nude group. Gary peeps on them making out, giving him a droopy dog face.
That makes me mad.
The cock is summarily blocked by Sarah, who calls right before sexy time can really commence. This leads to Scott wanting to go into town for some alcohol and to straighten out that bumpkin sheriff. He sees a stranger running around, though, and gets a face full of bat when he tries to investigate.
Tonight, on a very special sports night.
Gary shows up right after to check on Jill, and Merv scares her for the fourth time in 45 minutes. This time, Gary escorts him out. Sarah arrives to spend some time with Jill, but we dissolve into her saying goodbye. That's unfortunate. Laurie Minetti and Antonia Salchek actually seem to have some on-screen chemistry together. Comparatively speaking. Sarah is stalked by a pantyhose pervert who, I assume, is the same guy who took the Polaroids. She rushes into the barn where he promptly captures her, hangs her by her feet, and strips her. For those of you into the slasher drinking games, he does trace her ribcage with the tip of his knife. Take a drink. He slits her throat hog style, which seems to be the go-to MO for this killer. Also, this is very clearly not Tiny Tim, so I guess we have a creepy clown running around tying people up, and, separate from that, a pantyhose-headed throat slasher. Just what in the name of Tommy Thompson is going on in Wisconsin? Jill hears none of this because she's listening to that damn rock and roll music, waiting for Scott to come back. Gary comes over and offers to let her stay at his place, but she says she wants to wait for Scott. The amount of nothing that's going on in this film is unfathomable. Except Jill gets ethered again and is taken to the barn where Scott has to watch her get molested. You know how I will occasionally talk about characters who do things and characters who things happen to? Well, Jill has done nothing to advance the plot of this movie. And that's probably why there isn't one. For reasons passing understanding, the killer is interrupted by the berries and cherries of the sheriff's squad car. I'm not sure what he's there for since no one called him. I mean, maybe someone heard Sarah screaming earlier, but this farm is pretty remote. Jill wakes up and goes to get some juice, but it's the old bucket of the boyfriend's esophagus blood in the fridge trick. Too far, Winston Bishop. Gary just happens to be on the scene as literally the only character left in the movie who is not the sheriff. Jill is in shock, so Gary does what any nice guy would do. Strip her naked and erotically bathe with her, making extra sure her breasts are clean. What a swell guy. After she's clean, he takes her to the couch and starts to rape her unconscious body. And I'm not entirely clear on why she's unconscious because he didn't knock her out and she wasn't unconscious when they got out of the tub. Maybe she's supposed to be in shock, but her eyes are closed. It looks like she's just asleep. At any rate, she snaps out of it and tells him to get off her and out of her. But they can still be friends? Far be it from me to tell a woman what her boundaries should be, but I think the average woman would have kicked both of the Dickinson boys in the nuts several times by now. Speaking of, Merv comes back because Jill just refuses to lock her front door. He drags her over to the Dickinson house and tells her about how his and Gary's parents really died. The bank was foreclosing, so the parents hung themselves. In order to protect Merv and the farm, Gary made it look like murder. Huh. It's usually the opposite. What a twist! Gary arrives back at the house and struggles with his brother. That leads to a confused Jill shooting Merv. She's in shock again, but Gary tells her that this is actually perfect because they're the only people left now and they can be married. She of course tells him that he's crazy and runs away to hide in the safest place possible, the barn. Gary dons his peeper persona and chases her, only to take off the peeper costume when he finds her. They go back and forth with Jill pretending to be into Gary twice, and Gary mounting a villain soliloquy twice. He was so lonely after she left, being stuck with his goofy brother and depressed parents. After they killed themselves, it was just Merv. So now he thinks if he kills everyone close to Jill and isolates her, she'll have to marry him. Eventually, she loses a struggle over a knife, but Mervo returns to shoot Gary after having changed his overalls and patched the bullet hole. Merv and Jill leave together, but Gary opens his eyes. Although not in the evil I'll see you in the sequel way that the director was probably going for. More in the he's surprised Jill came back into the barn to tell him she forgives him and still loves him as a friend sort of way. The draw of this movie, and the only reason anyone has ever heard of it, is of course Tiny Tim. Most horror fans under the age of 40 probably only know Tiny Tim through his inclusion in the Insidious soundtrack with Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Tiny Tim was a mainstay novelty act throughout the 60s and 70s that waned going into the 1980s. If you've seen his act, you know that his performance here is basically just his public persona inside of a horror movie. I'm not sure if there's a better example of he contained multitudes than Tiny Tim. This Tiny Tim character was relentlessly positive and joyful. In his personal life, he didn't identify as bisexual, but harbored attractions to both men and women. He was a devout Catholic. He was a self-taught musician. He patterned his look after Rudolph Valentino. He beat his wife and said that Jesus okayed it. He was a deadbeat dad. As a 37-year-old, he married a 17-year-old on The Tonight Show in front of the nation. He had a near-fatal heart attack on stage in 1996, footage of which you can currently find all over YouTube and TikTok. He died of an actually fatal heart attack while on stage the same year. For a man named Tiny Tim, he was a larger-than-life character. And he is the most interesting thing about the movie. Actually, he's the only interesting thing about this movie. There's not much of a movie here to speak of. It's just Jill being terrorized for an hour before it's revealed to be the most obvious person. Lead actress Ivana Salchek seems to have dropped off the face of the earth after this film, and that's understandable. She's a beautiful woman, and I can see why they cast her, but she doesn't have the acting chops to carry a film while she's not delivering lines. When she has to react to something, it usually involves some form of touching her face, and is very distracting. I can't imagine she got much direction though, and it has to be difficult playing off Tiny Tim. I'm sure she would have gotten better with time and a better production, but, well, here we are. It's too bad this is her only credit. Part of the problem with the film seems to be that Rebane, who threw all this together, is not much of a horror fan, by his own admission. Horror is cheap to make, and as far as movies go, it's a good return on investment. And this does feel like we just have to put a good poster on that movie. That's why that woman that Merv was keeping in the basement never gets an explanation. I mean, I guess it was Jill's mom, maybe? I've been through this movie backwards and forwards, and she's just sort of there. I guess it's a red herring to make you think that Merv is the killer. But if Merv is keeping her hostage and Gary is killing them, well, Merv is one of the killers. I know that Nicolas Cage has said that he based the character of Longlegs on his mother, and all of this may just be a coincidence. But when you watch Blood Harvest, it's almost impossible not to see the parallels with Marvelous Mervo. And it's kind of weird that it happened twice, you know? Even if there is no inspiration there, Longlegs fans may still get a kick out of Tiny Tim's performance. Lord knows that's the only thing the film has to offer. And that's Blood Harvest. A collection of grifty nonsense or a hidden gem depending on your mileage. Stay cool, stay safe, wash your hands, return your shopping carts, make good choices, and I'll see you next time.
Things that bother you never bother me. I feel happy and fine, ha-ha! Living in the sunlight, loving in the moonlight, having a wonderful time. Having got a lot, I don't need a lot, coffee's only a dime. Living in the sunlight, loving in the moonlight, having a wonderful